Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest issue of Accented in the Spaces of Silence, where we'll be speaking with the poet SOPHIA TERAZAWA about her recent and upcoming projects. I'm Viet Thanh Nguyen, the host of Accented, and the producer for this show from Doan, the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network. Doan believes that the stories and aesthetics of a thriving Vietnamese diaspora can unite our global community in its mission to celebrate and foster diasporic Vietnamese literary voices. As refugees, immigrants, survivors, and their descendants, whose complex and diverse stories must be heard, Doan aims to champion and pass these stories on to current and future generations. We've been putting on Accented Dialogues in Diaspora ever since the pandemic started, and 30 shows and 2 years later, we've kept it going with the support of many of you. In Accented Dialogues in Diaspora, we aim to provide an intimate space to facilitate collaboration and connection between our community members and Southeast Asian and Vietnamese cultural producers to gather in conversation on their work, stories, passions, inspirations, and what they've been up to. Our guest tonight is the poet SOPHIA TERAZAWA. She is the author of Winter Phoenix, a book of testimonies in verse, and her next poetry collection is Anon, available in February with Deep Vellum. SOPHIA, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me, and thank you also to Kathleen, Frederick, DJ Puzzle, and everyone who's attending.
And to everybody out there listening as well. I'm thrilled to have you on. I love talking to poets. You know, my primary work is as a novelist and as a scholar, but I like to read poetry to remind myself that things like language and rhythm and voice are really crucial to any form of writing. I'd like to start off talking a little bit about you as a poet, because I know that your body of work deals a lot with border crossing and boundary breaking, hybrid identities. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about your emergence as a poet dealing with these kinds of themes.
Sure, absolutely. Well, first of all, I realize I think my father might be in the audience. So I want to make sure I greet my father. So, konbanwa, otou-san, genki desu ka? I hope you're doing well. I know where I come from, and I come from a very complicated lineage. I find my parents, they had a love marriage, which was really unusual in their family. My father's side, they were not very pleased when they found out about my father falling in love with a Vietnamese boat person. And the way they fell in love was through these unspoken silences that they shared with each other. And my father just knew from the moment he met my mom that she would be the one. And he fought to be with her. And growing up, I was always kind of struggling in between who I was as a person. I feel like oftentimes we hear about a double consciousness, and I would argue that I had a triple consciousness because I am very aware of my positionality in history of being both someone of an imperial power, but also someone of a colonized body. And I was really aware of that history from a young age.
Wow, that's really fascinating. Before we get to the poetry, I just want to follow up on this fascinating love story.
Yes, I love, let me light a candle. I'm sorry, otou-san, gomen nasai. I hope I'm not embarrassing him too much.
Well,
right now. He did, my mother told me he was going to be in attendance tonight, and I do see him.
I think that's part of a loving relationship, is for children to embarrass their parents and parents to embarrass their children. And right now you're on the center stage. You talked about this idea that there's this complicated relationship between an imperial country like Japan and a colonized country like Vietnam. And of course, Japan was in Vietnam for a few years, 1941 to 1945. And that was a kind of a complicated moment in history, because on the one hand, the Vietnamese were actually kind of thrilled to see the Japanese coming into Vietnam and defeating and subjugating the French. It was sort of a moment in time where the Vietnamese could recognize that their French conquerors were actually vulnerable and helped to set the stage for the Vietnamese Revolution that was going to take place. But of course, at the same time, Japan was an imperial power, like you said, and its place in Asia was oftentimes quite terrifying in terms of what it was doing. Does that history figure into your, well, obviously your personal life, but does it also figure into your poetry as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm constantly working both in and against the language that I've been given. I grew up speaking Japanese and English simultaneously. When someone asks me what my first language is, it's very hard to answer. I spoke both in my household, but for some reason, my mother never taught me Vietnamese. And she might argue today that I didn't want to learn Vietnamese, which is hard to hear as an adult thinking back to how my mother must have interpreted me as a child not wanting to learn her language and what she might have had to project on me as the daughter of a refugee, and also dealing with the insecurity of trying to please her in-laws and trying to prove that she was worthy enough to be with my father. And so she conceded to me, in a way, being colonized by a specific language and putting her language on the back spot.
I'm a deep believer in the idea that a writer's autobiography, especially from childhood, plays a very important role in the writing and in their identity as an author, either explicitly or implicitly. And and when you talk about this idea that there are these multiple languages in your household and that you had to choose or felt that you had to choose, it resonates a lot with me. And I think with a lot of refugees and immigrants, because a lot of us, I mean, some of us are fortunate to grow up in households where there is no choice. I mean, we can learn English and Vietnamese or whatever the other language is, but sometimes we do feel like we have to choose one or the other or prioritize one or the other. And in some cases, with three languages in the house, it becomes even more complicated. I'm just kind of curious about this. Why didn't you feel like you wanted to learn Vietnamese versus Japanese, or is that too personal?
No, I'm happy to go personal. Sometimes I worry about getting too personal myself. No, it's interesting because as a child, I never thought to speak my mother's language. I think growing up, whenever she spoke Vietnamese around me, I had these distinct memories of singing along to Paris by Night with my mother and her being really embarrassed if I ever started singing Vietnamese, specifically when it was just me and her. And I internalized that shame of performing a specific Vietnameseness. And I became very acutely aware that I'm also read more Japanese than Vietnamese. And then ultimately too, when I started learning Vietnamese on my own, I remember trying to speak to my mother, and she got so unnerved by it that she told me to stop because it made her, she uses the word itchy, it made her feel really itchy. And so I stopped learning, and I'm very private about my Vietnamese and how much I know. And I think that I don't know how long it will stay private for me, but for now it's almost like a secret language that I'm having maybe with God or maybe with an ancestor.
I just find this really fascinating, and it's because typically, when as a Vietnamese American person, I mean, the language issues you're describing are actually, I think, fairly common. But it's usually between Vietnamese and English, and not just between Vietnamese, English, and another language like Japanese in this case. And we've heard a lot, I think, or at least some, from people of mixed race backgrounds, where they talk about the challenges and difficulties of being mixed race, whether because they're Vietnamese, but one of their parents is Black or white or French or American and so on. We've heard less, I think, about people of mixed backgrounds like you, Japanese and Vietnamese, because there's a kind of a blending that takes place, I guess. You could pass as one person or another, Japanese American or Vietnamese American, for example, no matter how you feel. But you're also describing this internal tension within you, but also within your family, apparently. If your mother's feeling itchy when you're speaking Vietnamese, it's a really interesting dynamic. I'm just wondering, do you feel pressure to be Japanese American or Vietnamese American? And is that something that's specific to where you were growing up, which we didn't even talk about yet?
Let me think. I'm I'm aware of my parents being here, and I don't want to embarrass them. um, hmm. I think for me, where I feel in my relationship with language goes beyond the language itself, and it perhaps speaks to the theme of silence that we're dancing around tonight. And the silence is the unspeakable things that have happened, not just between Japanese and Vietnamese people, but between any combination of any oppressor, oppressed peoples. And I feel very close to it historically. On my father's side, his father served in the Imperial Army during World War II. He was a prisoner of war ultimately in Russia. And I'm not so sure about the lineage before that, but it's my understanding that many men on my father's side served to some capacity to the Japanese state. My mother, on the other hand, she has these stories of revolutionary women in her family, women who resisted in all different ways. My mother learned how to shoot a gun in school. She learned how to fight, and she was really proud of being a fighter. And so I have these profound conflicting stories of what it means to fight with my body, that the language, it fails me sometimes. When I really think about the horrors of it, the extent to which someone might be compelled to pick up a gun, whether it's for their state or whether it's to protect their own body. And that horror, I hold it really carefully close to my body.
If you are just tuning in, I am Viet Thanh Nguyen, the host of Accented Dialogues in Diaspora. I'm speaking with the poet SOPHIA TERAZAWA, and the theme of our show is In the Spaces of Silences. And we've just been talking about silences and the difficulties of history and colonialism and being of mixed background and of personal secrets and family privacies and intimacies and how difficult it is to talk about these things. And I totally empathize because I just finished writing a memoir, and it's the hardest book I ever had to write, getting into my own personal family dynamics. So I totally empathize with you, but I'm still going to keep on asking you questions because it's totally fascinating to hear these kinds of stories. But first, let's talk about the poetry as well. You are on your second manuscript, but your first book was Winter Phoenix Testimonies in Verse. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that before we hear a reading from that book?
Okay, absolutely. Well, in short, I got my heart broken terribly in 2017, and I wrote this book really quickly. It's not an intellectual book for me. It was a book of my heart. And it's been difficult to talk through it because I oftentimes feel like this book is not a book that I wrote. It's a book that came through me, and it's still going through me. It was published, I think, a little over a year ago today. And so I just picked it up and I'm looking at it now, and you can see my copy. I've covered it in stickers as a way to find some levity and to protect my heart. But ultimately, Winter Phoenix is a document of testimonies that I've channeled, that I've allowed me to move through in combining both language and martial law and history. But ultimately, really, it's a story of my mother, and it's a story of me surviving because my mother survived.
Okay, and you're going to read an excerpt from that, from Winter Phoenix for us, right?
Absolutely. And I hope this speaks to rhythm, perhaps. This poem is called Short Recess. We've traveled far to say how this was brave, if not unjust. The metal recessed like a limit, justice dark as wind-whipped starlit dunes. Our juries whispered, reaching forward in deliberation like an aftermath of crimes, ingrained to sentencing for what would happen in that country of our people, made invasive withal, ordering this genocide. You were made a lie. I was made a lie. Inside of us, beloved, how could I redact you? Why did you just stand there and say nothing?
Thank you for sharing that. You know, Vietnamese experience, for better and for worse, has so often been, I don't know if it reduced is the right term, but focused on these historical issues of colonialism and war and trauma and all these things that we see in media images and in books and so on. And Winter Phoenix does touch on that. How do you negotiate between the need to talk about those things and possibly the need to not talk about those things as well?
Such a powerful question. I think for me, it comes down to the need to be alive. My mother made the choice to stay alive. She constantly reminds me that. And so for me, telling a story is not merely recounting a past, and it's not merely recounting a trauma. It's using the music of the language to show that I can still sing. That maybe even if my mother doesn't understand the words that are coming out of my mouth, that somehow she can still feel the rhythm of the voice, and she can see that I can breathe and I can scream and I can shout. And I am more than just her pain.
Oh, wow. And you're sharing this with your mother and your father listening to it as well. Have you read your poems to your parents?
Um, my father has actually heard me only one time, I think. お父さん、is that right? I don't know. He'll tell me later. My mother, I have a complicated relationship with my mother in language. Her English is not very good. I don't know if she's here tonight. She has a hard time facing my language because she understands the rhythm of pain, and she understands what I'm doing when I'm mirroring it. And I can see how it moves through her. But most of the time she'll say she doesn't understand, but I can feel on maybe a bodily level, she knows what I'm doing. Oh.
Your father in the comments section, for those of you who are listening to us, has just written that in fact they are
My mom's
watching.
gonna call me later. She's gonna be like, "Oh my gosh, Sophia, why can't you be professional?" I'm
No,
sorry, Mom.
I don't know if people who are not writers understand, but to be a writer, I think for those of us who do it right, is an act of courage. It's an act of courage because you're delving into your own life, your own emotions, whether you write autobiographically or not. But you have to delve into your own emotions because that's where the power of the writing comes from. We don't make up emotions; we feel them in order to put them into our work. And especially with your own poetry, I can hear it in your voice. You're talking about how the poetry itself carries the rhythm and the feeling, but also in your own voice and your own persona, I can hear it as well. The difficulty of speaking about these things, about your life and about your family, and it's an act of courage to share poetry with an audience. To share the most intimate things that you have felt and thought with an audience, much less your parents. And so, actually, I think I want to give a shout out to your parents as well, because I'd imagine it's kind of hard for them to hear what's being said also. So it's hard in both ways. I'm also kind of stunned by the fact that you published Winter Phoenix last year, and now you have another collection of poetry already finished in manuscript that will be coming out next year. Anon, most of our audience obviously has not seen this collection. So I'm wondering if you can tell us about Anon and what it's about.
I'm like actually really embarrassed. I'm sorry. I went to therapy before this, and I was like, I'm gonna be cool and I'm gonna be collected. I'm gonna be so professional in front of my hero, and here I am falling apart. So Anon was me trying to find love again. Ultimately, I wrote Anon about in 2 weeks. I wrote it very manically, and I wanted to write to an adverb ultimately. But it really came out of conversations that I had during an artist residency in Slovenia, where I met beautiful people who had their own histories outside of Vietnam, who had histories of also genocide and colonialism to some extent, and to war. I met incredible Serbian poets, poets from Bosnia, poets from Croatia, poets who dealt with complicated histories around nationalism and fascism. And having those conversations were really profound for me because it allowed me to see that ultimately at the core of it, even when things seem so unconnected, we're all just learning how to love each other without killing each other in the end.
Really amazing. Well, I mean, Winter Phoenix collection of testimonies, and this is more of a collection of love poems. And also you were saying it's the title's Anon. It's an adverb, but I'm not sure that everybody in our audience will know what Anon means. And for those of you in the audience who are just tuning in, I'm Viet Thanh Nguyen. I'm the host of Accented Dialogues in Diaspora. Our episode today is In the Spaces of Silence with the poet SOPHIA TERAZAWA. We're here talking about her first book, Winter Phoenix, and now about her second forthcoming book, Anon. And can you tell us what Anon means and why you chose it for the title?
Yes, I'll start with why I chose it. So I found a muse when I was in Slovenia. And I think we were each other's muses. It was like, I don't know if you have a literary soulmate, but I find that this person was one of my many literary soulmates, and we started writing poems to each other. And so I would directly address these poems to this person, and it was super generative and very healing and whole. And it was in conversations around genocide and what that means, and histories that might seem not connected on the surface. And then as I was thinking about healing my heart from past heartbreaks, I started to realize that this person was Eros to some extent. It was the god of love. And maybe it's a platonic sense of love where I'm not sure if the audience is familiar with Plato's idea of love, where ultimately love transcends the love of the body, and then the love of knowledge, and then ultimately the love of the state. One might think that love ends on God, but Plato argues that love goes beyond God and love goes to beauty. And so I thought, well, how beautiful would it be to go beyond Eros and to go to the ultimate anonymous, which is beauty. And then when I started looking up the shortened form of anonymous, which is Anon, I realized that it's an adverb that means soon or shortly thereafter. And I thought, how beautiful. It's time overlapping time. And so I wanted to write a book that felt like I could sing to every generation behind me and every generation in front of me. I really hope that this love reaches forever.
Terrific. And can we hear an excerpt from Anon for the audience out there?
Absolutely. This poem is a sexy poem. So I'm going to ask my dad to close his ears. It's a sexy poem. It's called The Kiss. Walk with me, Anon. Arresting thunder. Should I leave the way a siege? What blossoms underwater? Should I wave for you, breathy rose of peach? Sink us down a throne. It has to be Eros. That your birthday led to a bombing of a city. Soon I shower. Bus on fire. Both work out of time. Locust. Yesterday I walked. Thorn and nettle. Disappearing.
That was beautiful. It's really interesting, because I'm a father, and my oldest child is 9 years old, and I think, oh, there's gonna be a moment when we have to talk about sex and the body and all these kinds of things, and very, very, very soon. And then I think, now that you remind me of this, well, in about 10, 20 years, he might feel exactly the same thing. God, I have to talk to my father about sex and the body and all of that. So these questions of intimacy, cut both ways. And there's multiple audiences, right? For when we're writers. I mean, there's like this anonymous audience out there referencing the title of your book. I have no idea who out there is going to be picking up your book and reading it. But then there's also the audience of people who know you, from your peers to your friends to your parents, as we've talked about earlier. One of the references that appears in Anon is this Japanese period painting, two gibbons reaching for the moon. And maybe you can describe that image to us so the audience can visualize it.
Absolutely. So it's a period piece by the Japanese painter Ito Jakuchu. For those of us who are in the south of the US, you can visit this at the Houston Art Museum. It features in ink a picture of one parent gibbon holding a near replica of a tiny baby gibbon. There's no image of the actual moon, but it's assumed that they're reaching toward the reflection of the moon. And it's ultimately, I think, a reflection of exile. It's my mother and myself. It's my ancestors and my mother that at the end of the day, we're always reaching toward not the moon, but perhaps how we can see ourselves in the moon, in the water.
Well, how does this action of reaching for a reflection of something that isn't actually there play into the experience of displacement and genocide, which are some of these themes in your work?
It's love. I know it's corny, but it's my mother made a decision on the boat. Mom, I know you're listening, but I know you made the decision to stay alive so one day you can meet me. She wanted to meet me, and that was what kept her alive. And so the reaching is not an intellectual exercise, and it's not an intellectual exercise of justice either. It's a exercise of love. And even if you never reach the country that you want to reach, my mother never planned to come to the US. She just knew she had to get into the water. And for me, and maybe for her, that was an act of realizing that she's getting into the water so that she can love. And so the moon was the ocean. And maybe I'm her moon. I don't know. Maybe we're both still reaching for it.
I think that's really powerful. You know, this idea that the lives of others helps to keep us alive too, right? And that poetry can express that as powerfully perhaps as other human relations, and that your mother's gesture of keeping herself alive for you is then transmuted eventually into poetry that embodies the history of both your family, but also of all these other vast histories of war and colonialism and the refugee experience that we've referenced. I want to end with you talking about your process as a poet. What was the difference between writing your first book, Winter Phoenix, and this book, Anon, that we'll be seeing very soon from Deep Vellum?
They came from the same heart space. And Winter Phoenix was mostly ancestral. It was a feeling of completely falling apart emotionally when I realized that I didn't love myself enough to protect myself. And that's when Joy Harjo often speaks of being visited by her ancestors as well. And I think it was a point for me when I was so broken that my ancestors came and stepped in and they said, we're standing with you and we're going to do this together. And so Winter Phoenix came out of that. Anon was an entirely selfish book. And I wrote it because I just wanted to express my love to one person, and then ultimately that one person became beyond that one person. I also listened to a lot of Bjork. So Winter Phoenix, I listened to the album Vespertine on loop. And then Anon, I mostly listened to one song called Black Lake over and over again.
We've been talking to the poet SOPHIA TERAZAWA, who has a forthcoming book, Anon, from Deep Vellum, and who is the author of Winter Phoenix. I'm Viet Thanh Nguyen, the host of Accented Dialogues in Diaspora. SOPHIA, I want to thank you for sharing your poetry and yourself with us in such a beautiful and courageous fashion. Good luck with the launch of Anon.